So at the moment we've got our SOAP service, and when we send in some request that gives us a problem, so for instance here we're sending in a GET request, which would typically be for our WSDL, and we don't actually specify that we want the WSDL, this will give us a problem. And at the moment it's just giving us back the error and an HTTP 400 to say that it's a bad request. So this doesn't comply with the SOAP specification. If we look at the SOAP specs, we can see that for a SOAP 1.1 service, we should get back a SOAP fault that represents this kind of XML structure. So we get a fault code of SOAP server and some kind of string to tell us what the error is, and then anything else that we want to specify in the detail. SOAP 1.2, they changed this structure considerably and changed some of the values. So instead of SOAP server, you get SOAP sender. So the structure changes significantly between SOAP 1.1 faults and SOAP 1.2 faults. So we need to go and look at how we can deal with this, so that when we call our service with an invalid WSDL request, for instance, we would get back a SOAP 1.1 fault that looks something like this, or a SOAP 1.2 fault that looks something like this. So let's go and dig in and see how we can do this. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along or welcome back to the channel. So let's have a look at error handling today. So let's just dig in and create a SOAP fault detail class inside of our main SOAP folder. So remember, this SOAP folder is our reusable folder that we could take from project to project. And then within here we've got a model folder that overrides the various SOAP classes as we need them, so that we can add in things that are specific to this particular project and set of services that we're implementing. So we're creating a generic SOAP fault detail here, and we're just going to create a placeholder class essentially that we could override to add in anything to the SOAP fault detail that we need for our particular implementation. And if you're not sure what all this XML declaration namespace is all about, I did a video on messing around with XML namespaces, and that's what this provides you here, is the ability to add namespaces in at this level of the XML document if you want, so that you can specify prefixes and all sorts for anything that you add in at this level. So again, this is a placeholder that you might find useful if you're adding in additional elements to this SOAP fault detail for your particular project. So let's also go and create ourselves a generic SOAP fault class that again likewise we could override if we wanted to. And the only interesting point here is that we're defining an enumeration, and this is primarily used so that the code can tell the SOAP fault where the fault is. So if the fault is on the client side, they've sent in something that doesn't make sense to the server, or if it's a server side error. And we're doing it this way, defining an enumeration, because this will then allow us to handle the fact that we need to deal with SOAP 1.1 and 1.2 using this generic SOAP fault class. So having created a base SOAP fault class that's an abstract one, let's go and create a SOAP 1.1 fault that is specific to the SOAP 1.1 spec. So we derive off of SOAP fault, and then we can start adding in the various bits and pieces that we need that are specific to a SOAP 1.1 fault. So we need to understand whether it is a client or a server fault, as we saw in the example at the start. We need, for serialization purposes, we need to add in a default constructor, and you can see it's complaining about this fault string. So let's go and add in the elements that we need. So we've got a fault string and a SOAP fault detail properties. We also need a fault code. So just checking on what we're adding here. Inside a SOAP fault, we've got a fault code, a fault string, and a detail section. So we've got a fault code, a fault string, and a detail section. But the fault code we need to actually do some formatting on. So we're going to ignore the actual value and add in another element that actually is the fault code. Let's just make this a little bit easier to read. So it's a read-only property, essentially, that formats a string based on the fault code that we've specified here. And then it adds in a namespace prefix from the default SOAP namespace prefix that we've already specified in our code in a previous tutorial. So that should get us something like SOAP server formatted up, and then we can put our message into the fault string. And then we'll just add in a convenience constructor as well, so that we can populate those two things as we need them. So that is a SOAP 1.1 fault. Now let's go and create a SOAP 1.2 fault. That gives us the basics of a SOAP 1.2 fault, and it is in the SOAP 1.2 namespace. So like we did with our SOAP 1.1, let's create our SOAP 1.2 fault codes, which in this case are now sender and receiver rather than client and server. And I'm also going to add in some placeholder fault codes for a sub fault code. And these are really around security, which we'll get to in another tutorial. But we're going to put the basics of some of this in here. So these are security kind of error codes that you would put into a sub fault, and these are the text that go along with those particular error codes. So then let's just put in an example so that we understand what we're doing here. So let's create our default constructor, empty parameterless constructor that we need for serialization. And we can see here that we've got some missing classes. So we need a reason class, and we need a fault code class, and we need a code property and a reason property. So we've still got some more to add in here. I'm going to go and define the rest of the constructors here, and we'll just work our way down through it. So these are all the constructors. So we can pass in a fault code. By default gets set to receiver, or we can pass in a specific fault code and a reason, as we'll see, and that populates up these properties that we're going to add. So let's move on and add in some of these properties. So we can add in a property of type fault code, which just is called code. So that's this fella here. We can then add in our reason property, which is for this guy. According to the spec, the SOAP fault also has a SOAP node element, so we need to go and add that in. And this is a little bit more tricky because we want to populate this as a URI, so we're going to do this the same way that we've done with populating the fault code. So we'll have a kind of real property that we can populate with a URI, but we won't serialize that, and then we'll override that with a proper serialized version where we can use that to return what we want to actually be serialized into the XML. So that gives us the node element, and then we've got this role element here, which again will define that as a URI and override that with a stringified version of it. And then the last bit is to add in our SOAP fault detail that can just be set to a SOAP fault detail object. So we're still missing some of these classes, so let's go and add in this fault code class. I'm going to do that in here because it's very specific to a SOAP 1.2 fault, so just for convenience I'll put it in the same file. So the fault code has two properties, a value and the possibility to have a subcode within it. So we'll do our default parameterless constructor, but we'll protect that so that you can't actually create it using that. And then we'll add in some real constructors that we want our code to be able to use. So you can pass in a fault code, or you can pass in a fault code and a sub-fault code. And as we can see here, this is trying to create a new fault code object. So it's a kind of recursive class. It creates itself with a sub-fault code. So we need a constructor here that can take a sub-fault code, and then that's going to populate this using that sub-fault code. And by default, I'm putting all of those sub-fault codes into a SOAP security namespace prefix. As I said earlier, these are all SOAP security errors. So for now, we can hard code this to a SOAP security namespace prefix. Let's go and add in to our soap constants, that constant that we need for the soap security namespace prefix. So along with our soap prefix, we add in the soap security namespace prefix, which is typically WSSE. So that's our full code class. So the other one that we're missing is the reason class. So let's move on and have a look at the reason class. And again, I'm going to define that in here just for ease of grouping the code and keeping things nicely together. So the reason just has an array of text elements, strings is essentially is what it comes out as. And then if we add in our constructors, we'll see that we can pass in a new text object or a string to populate that as we need. But now we need this text object. And let's create one of those. And for the text object, we're going to allow it to have a culture info, but we're not going to serialize that culture info out. We're going to ignore that. The only thing we're going to serialize out is the actual value. Again, let's do our usual parameterless constructor. So we just set that up to some default culture, or we can allow you to pass in a string value and optionally a culture as well. And then what we also need is, if we just go and look at the example, we can see that our text has a lang attribute within it. So we need to go and define that lang attribute. So we specify an XML attribute that sits in the default XML namespace, and we can just get the name of the culture out. So that is a SOAP 1.2 fault complete, or as complete as I'm going to take it. So now we need to look at plugging these SOAP faults in at the various points in our XML response structure. So we've got our SOAP response body class at the moment, but what we need is a SOAP response body for each type of SOAP response, so a 1.1 or a 1.2, because we need to have a SOAP 1.2 or 1.1 fault respectively. So we've got this partial SOAP response body. So I'm going to define a SOAP 1.1 response body that derives from it. And the SOAP 1.1 response body has a fault element of type SOAP 1.1 fault that sits in the SOAP 1.1 namespace. And we're just giving ourselves a convenience method here to create a fault. So we'll do likewise with a SOAP 1.2 response body. And now we'll pass in a SOAP 1.2 fault code and a reason. So very much SOAP 1.2 specific stuff, and that sits in the SOAP 1.2 namespace. And just for the serializer to work and be aware that there are these two classes that derive off of this, we need to do an XML include against the SOAP response body so that it's aware of these two subclasses. So that's our SOAP response body. So now let's go and have a look at the SOAP response envelope. And at the moment, the SOAP response envelope for SOAP 1.1 and 1.2 all derive off of this common SOAP response envelope class that just has a SOAP response body. We need to change this around a little bit. So what we can do is add in to here a new method to go and create us a SOAP response body, and we can check if the type is a SOAP response 1.1 response, then we create a SOAP 1.1 response body. If not, we create a SOAP 1.2 response body. And then we're going to change this body around just a little bit. So we're going to ignore this body property now, and instead of just newing up that, we'll call that new virtual method that we just created. And then inside of our respective SOAP response envelopes, we can add in a new property called body typed, which allows us to get the body actually typed correctly as a 1.1 response body, in this case for the 1.1 response envelope. But when we come to serialization, we will serialize that out as the body element. And again, this is using that virtual method to create a response body. So let's go and do the same for SOAP 1.2. So that gives us our XML classes right the way up to the SOAP response envelope. So what I'm going to do now is just add a utility class to help me give back some SOAP fault responses. I'm going to define just some SOAP faults on here utility classes that allow me to create soap faults given a variety of different types of shape of soap fault that I want to create. And this is going to kick up for now, but I'm going to add in some more flavors of soap fault so that we can create soap 1.1 and 1.2 style soap faults. And we can see that what we arrive at the end is a soap fault result that they all call. That creates us a soap fault with a 500 status error, sends back content type of XML, as we always need with a soap response. Should always be XML, and a soap fault should always be an HTTP 500. So all of these eventually cascade down to creating this soap fault result here. So that's given us a nice utility class to create different styles of soap faults that we can call from elsewhere in our code. So let's keep working our way up. So we're now starting to look at controllers and how these will return soap faults. So remember, this soap controller base is the one that all of our soap controllers derive off of. So let's go and add a region in here where we can contain all of our faults. We all have faults, obviously. It's just knowing what they are that's half the challenge. So let's add a method in here to go and create a soap fault. And this is going to use our utility class under the covers to go and actually create that soap fault response that we then return as an object result in our controller here. So this will create us a soap 1.1 or 1.2 response depending on the controller and what the soap version of that controller has been set to. Remember, in our attribute that we've used previously, we've just got a couple of different flavors of soap fault methods here. One takes in a fault string, the other one takes in a reason, so we just map the value out of that reason across in the soap 1.1 case. So now we've got a couple of nice methods here inside of our base controller that we can call to create ourselves a soap fault. And while we're in here, if you're following along, during our WSDL one, we left a couple of to-dos where we said these should be soap faults. So let's just go and fix this up now. So instead of a bad request, let's call one of those soap fault methods so we can get rid of that to-do. And instead of that bad request, we can make that a soap fault instead. And then down in here, we've got a couple more. So that's tidied up all of our error handling around WSDLs. So let's give this a build and a run and see how we've done. Now let's test our SOAP 1.1 service, and with a missing question mark WSDL, our invalid request is now sending us back an HTTP 500 with SOAP server and invalid request, as we would expect. And if we jump over to our SOAP 1.2 service and do the same, likewise we can see that we get back a SOAP 1.2 style SOAP fault, equally HTTP 500, but we get SOAP receiver this time, and we've got that nice text with the XML lang coming from that culture, and our text of our error that we're populating. So, and you might notice that this XML prefix is not defined anywhere, and it's up to you whether you really want to do that or not. You don't need to. It's already automatically defined for any XML document anyway. But if you wanted to, you could go back and look at the namespaces and define that prefix and constant in the namespace constants, and then you could add it in the constructor of a SOAP 1.2 response envelope. So back down in our response envelope in here, you've got this namespace, so you could add in here at this level, specifically for a 1.2, you could add in that XML if you really wanted to. That is it. That is SOAP 1.1 errors coming back and SOAP 1.2 errors coming back nicely from our SOAP service, and in a nice reusable fashion so that we can use that throughout our code base to report SOAP faults as we need to going forwards. We'll see that we might use some of these SOAP faults a little bit more. So I just want to ask you, are you finding this useful? Would you use this at all? Have you got a similar problem with soap services that you're dealing with? Let me know in the comments. And I just want to give a quick thank you and shout out to my sponsors of the channel, without whom I wouldn't still be doing this. So thanks for your support. It's very much appreciated. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.